Today we're going to talk a lot, and you folks might have heard our speakers earlier today, the folks from British Gas, talk about how they're transforming the customer experience by moving from essentially product push to more customer conversation. So I think in the customer experience, you guys have heard all about this week. Is there anybody that hasn't heard, the buzzwords around customer experience, digital transformation, that sort of thing? And somebody raises their hand in the back, of course. You've always got one, right? Well, let's put it this way. I'm willing to bet that each and every one of you has an experience in your back pocket where you interacted with a brand, and ultimately the nature of that interaction changed your relationship with that organization. Anybody here has actually interacted with the brand and it changed the way you thought about them? Raise your hands. Come on, anybody? No? There's somebody out here that hasn't? Well, one way or another, my experience is a little bit different. About a year and a half ago, I lived in the very sunshiny state of South Carolina. Can anybody tell me what it is in South Carolina? One thing about South Carolina more than any other, it's stinking hot all the time. It's like Vegas with humidity constantly. The thing about living in South Carolina, you live there for long enough, and I'm from the Northeast, you try to move back to the North, and it's incredibly painful. So my wife comes to me one day and she says, our kids never get to see the family, ever. So what I'd really like to do is let's move back to Massachusetts. And I thought all that goes off the warning bells in my head are ice storms, 12 feet of snow last winter, might as well have been summer. But my wife knows me hook, line, and sinker. She basically has a decision hub that ultimately, tells her what to do for me. And in that, what she said was, look, here's the property that I want to buy. And on it, look at this barn. She showed me a 3,000 square foot, 100-year-old barn that she said, this can be yours. This barn will be yours if we buy this property. And I said, man cave, 3,000 square foot man cave. You couldn't get any better than this. So I bought it, and we did what people do. We went to our bank, we sold our house, we got a new mortgage, and ultimately I made sure to ask, when we get this new mortgage, will I be able to get a home equity loan for this beautiful barn? And they said, absolutely no problem. So we applied for the loan, and can anybody guess what happened? We were immediately declined for the loan, right? So I myself understand this because as organizations, we have to protect ourselves. We have an obligation to make sure that we return on a financial investment. My wife is not quite so understanding. It's probably the best way to put it. So they put us into the dreaded, what I call the blue screen of death in financial services is we'll put you in a research queue. So 2 or 3 days, we'll tell you exactly what's going on. 2 weeks later, I call up the bank, they still have no idea. And you know what happens at that point? I get a direct mail piece from this bank targeting me for the same exact home equity loan they just declined me for. Then I start getting emails from this bank targeting me for that same home equity line. I call the bank, and the rep over-explains and tells me, all of our systems are disconnected. I don't know why this is happening. It's things he should never tell a customer, ever, right? So this doesn't exactly make any happier. But the kicker was, about a week later, someone called my wife and said, I heard you're interested in getting a mortgage. And she goes, no, home equity line. He goes, wait, you already have a mortgage? And she says, yes, it's with you. I have a mortgage. Now, I don't know what a great customer experience looks like for every brand, right? But I know that it's not that. They basically took us, and I tell the story for a reason. That's because they took us from an account holder with 11 accounts, and I'm talking checking, savings, money market, our 529s for our kids, our brokerage accounts. And they basically took us from brand advocates to what amounts to brand detractors, the kind of guy that will stand up here on the stage and tell everybody about it within the course of 2 weeks, right? So luckily for you folks and I, we've got a couple people here willing to talk to us today that know a lot more about the customer experience than I do. So our very first guest is essentially, he's worked for some of the largest banks in the United Kingdom, or some of the largest organizations in the United Kingdom. He's worked for Lloyds Bank and for Vodafone. And right now is championing, like I said earlier, that shift from product push to customer conversation. So I'd love to introduce Steve Thomas. Steve, come on up. Our second guest has garnered a great deal of respect as a decisioning expert in the entire market. She has been working on decisioning projects for years, and with both O2 and Vodafone. And right now, she's kind of the centerpiece of the British Gas effort to basically take next generation decisioning and overhaul the customer experience with that. And so I'd love to introduce Joe Allen. Joe, coming up. Okay, so Let's see here. And that's what I was supposed to do a couple minutes ago when I actually did this for you folks. All right. So what we're going to talk about today with these folks is we're going to talk about what is next generation decisioning to British Gas. What does that really mean? Ultimately, how they arrive at their vision, what their transformation plan looks like. We're going to talk about how today. Instead of what and why, we're going to talk about how they're going through this process. And they're going to talk about why it's working. And then ultimately, we'll sit down with you folks and have a little Q&A. So first off, before we get started, Steve, Joe, how did you folks come to work on this project, right? Like Steve, yourself, ultimately, how did you come to be kind of a centerpiece of this effort for British Gas?
So I suppose it's something that started way back 2 or 3 years ago, where I had an opportunity to join British Gas, and I think you already said I'd worked at a couple of other places, and really it was about British Gas were looking for somebody that kind of had been there, worn the T-shirt, done it and stuff, and I suppose, you know, British Gas is a really iconic brand. We said it in our presentation this morning. It's kind of like just over 200 years old, which is, I know a lot of people have been quoting stats, but I haven't come up anywhere more than 204, which we've got. But you know, generally the opportunity was to make a change to dynamic one-to-one customer management and actually really lead a team through that process and make that change. So that was really, highly important. And you know, this change here about an inbound and outbound experiences. When I kind of thought about dynamic customer management in the silos that you sometimes get, we were part of the problem because we'd always organised inbound and outbound separately. So it seemed much more logically to kind of bring that together and sort of solve that problem for the customer as well. And I guess that's where next generation decisioning came in.
Makes sense. Joe, how about yourself?
So I joined British Gas after spending 8 years working in decisioning for telcos. And all of that time I spent using Cordiant in KIQ days and also Cordiant for inbound. And I got to the point where you start wondering whether there is anything else out there apart from Cordiant and Pega. So I came to British Gas to work in Best Next Action there, which was a homegrown solution. So I talked about it earlier, it was a proof of concept built on raw SQL. And I wanted to see, because I'd done a lot in the capability space of decisioning, whether it worked. So of course, when we started talking about integrating the two in the capability, it was kind of obvious for me to step up and take ownership of the program.
Now, I know that you're kind of the centerpiece of a lot of this in terms that most of the work that goes on, one way, shape, or form kind of flows through you, right? So ultimately, how do you folks define next generation decisioning? Because I know it means something.
Absolutely it does. Amusingly, it was actually our IT people who started using the words next generation. So actually within British Gas, if you want to get a project off the ground, you call it next generation because it really helps you move forward. But joking aside, this was for us about making a generation jump. So we talked earlier on today about the fact that we had some solutions that were kind of starting to creak a little bit. And rather than taking a small step forward, we wanted to move to a place where we could grow into a solution and actually achieve a vision that was worth achieving rather than just taking a little baby step. So this is us about really taking a leap forward rather than just baby steps.
Oh, it makes sense. Steve, let me ask you this. Ultimately, in order to employ something like next generation decisioning, you folks had to have a vision, right? So ultimately, what did your vision look like? I heard you talk about it at CRM Evolved a couple of months ago, but can you kind of share that with the audience?
Yeah, so the vision really was about getting to a single customer conversation and managing that is in a much more contextual way. So a lot of one-to-one personalization we spoke a little bit about the organization had spent a lot of time being a one-size-fits-all organization, and we'd kind of done a little bit with segmentation, but really we knew that British Gas had huge power in its data assets, and really it was really a great opportunity to drive some of the new sort of analytics, modeling, adaptive learning technologies to really get down to kind of a segment of one. And what we were really more conscious about was starting to make sure that this conversation happened and flowed across in a seamless way across channels, I suppose. So we had a bit of a burning platform as well about wanting to make some technology changes, which we can probably talk about a little bit later. But those two things really married together to kind of deliver it.
That makes sense. Now, ultimately, up here on the screen, you talk about centralization of strategy. So
yeah.
Why is that important to the customer experience and what you folks are really
Okay.
trying to do?
So yeah, so really, we touched on it a little bit earlier. It's about there's a lot of overlap between some of these things, right? So if you're in different channels, you've still got to do management of those channels. You've got to create rules, strategies, offers, campaigns, whatever you kind of call them in each different channel. So kind of bringing it together allows us to see much more of that experience together. And for us, it's really about we kind of call it tube maps, effectively. So create tube maps for the customer about how, depending on whenever they might have bought something, they've started off in one place of the organisation, but we want to take them to a different place, how we might kind of move them around that tube map, and doing it in a centralized way. That one of the great stats at the start of this project, when we started to look who was talking to our customers, we actually found 9 different silos of customer communication, all very relevant. The things they were doing was absolutely driving customer experience, but somehow when you totted those things up, you got to 500 million things going to 10.5 million kind of customers and a few million prospects. So just that scale and velocity of it was kind of really scary.
Steve Thomas Verges, 500 million things ultimately going to 500 million customers. Joe, for yourself, Steve talks up here a little bit about timeliness.
Yep.
Now, why is timeliness, where does that come into play?
So I think timeliness is all about being relevant, so being in the moment. We talk a little bit within British Gas about kind of scenarios, and I think you have to bear in mind when you're moving towards a customer-centric organisation, which we're trying to do, that you want to be relevant to that customer and take into consideration the customer more than what British Gas wants.
Sure.
So, for example, if a customer's thinking about moving home, and I've talked about it already about my house move, the last thing I want to talk about is gas and electricity. The only reason I've done that is because I work for British Gas. The things that are important to me are my broadband and my Sky TV. So don't call me up and try and sell to me as soon as I've moved, because I'm not interested. Likewise, so we kind of start to think about how we might kind of space that out and start talking about people later. Likewise, there are events in customers' lives that, like having a baby, changes their kind of risk attitude. So if you actually tap into that point in time, you've got a much better chance of converting that conversation positively.
This makes complete sense to me. Now, Steve, ultimately with this vision, at the end of the day, when you explain it to management or when you're ultimately trying to get funding for something like this, you need to kind of drop it down a level and talk about ultimately how you're going to change the way that you do business.
Yeah.
So how did you folks explain that ultimately when you're trying to say this is why we need to invest? How did that kind of conversation go?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, actually. So, I've kind of heard that actually in the boardroom for kind of doing this, and when we did a lot of smart things. We created with our partners, Acura, we created a lot of visualization examples. So we talked about some of the things that would change in the channels and how the experiences would operate. But one of that questions that was typically answered or asked of me was, it feels like a great experience, but it's also a long way from where we are today. So how are we going to kind of get along that journey? It seems a long way to go. One of my answers, I think, there's a good quote somewhere along the way that if you want to go quickly, you go alone. But if you've got a long way to go, you go together. And so effectively, we came up with a series of programs of work. Effectively, you might think of it as kind of crawl, walk, run, which was about really delivering the kind of the changes we were going to make for this organisation. So to put a bit of context into that, the first one was particularly when I really arrived, was we'd actually put in a new platform already. We kind of brought our data warehouse back inside the organisation from a third party, and in that process we'd done actually a lot of work on the data, so our data was a lot better. But we hadn't done that much work with the tool set. We ran short of time, so there was a lot of fixing the basics as we had to do, and that was kind of getting the basics of campaign management and operating was worth a lot of money to us. That was worth about sort of £10 million a year for us to do that. Then we started to go, well, actually, these collection of campaigns we've got, they need a bit of organisation behind them, so we couldn't really tell exactly all things what they were. So we started to organise, around customer journeys, and now we're bringing in inbound and outbound together. And then in our third arc, I suppose that's really about taking it much more contextual and real time. So that's the kind of the work that we're going to deliver in the next 12 months of our program is finish off the inbound and outbound and start to move to real time.
Let me ask you this. So I've been in marketing for a long time, and I've done outbound for a long period of my career. And quite honestly, what you're talking about here, in some ways, would have scared me. I mean, ultimately, you're taking some of the maybe in an outbound marketer's eyes, you're taking some of their responsibility or control away. But did you folks feel like going into this, like what were the risks and rewards? And was there any pushback ultimately from your team on the campaign side around this?
Yeah, I suppose a couple of things. So those arcs were designed to really be about sort of periods of 6 to 9 months pieces of work. So we could, absolutely start to demonstrate we're delivering some value back to the organisation and create that feel that we are good for it. I think that was one of the important things to do. And then, actually, you can see now that actually we're starting to be really seen as at the seat of the table now for driving some of the experiences and some of the value in the organisation. So yes, you're right. It feels like a good, it feels like a shift in accountability, and if that is a risk, but it was something I was actually up for, and I think actually it started to give the wider insight and data team within British Gas a lot more presence and a lot more credibility around the organisation. So I think it was overall it was a good move, but because we kind of planned our work out, we kind of knew that we could kind of take the teams through it at a pace really, and start. And I guess that was a little bit of why one of our thinking about doing some of all the channels first and bringing it together, not necessarily trying to do real time first, which I know a lot of other organisations have done.
So rather than go channel by channel, let's consolidate and then ultimately move it out that way.
Yeah,
this makes sense. Joe, let me ask you something. So ultimately, you folks have a platform that you are worried maybe isn't going to get you to where you need to be in the long term. What kind of process did you have to go through, and what kind of determination, how did you make that determination? We want to stay here, or we want to kind of go in a different direction?
So back towards the end of 2014, we started to think about this a little bit more. So Steve and I had talked about it for a number of years about bringing the two together, but they weren't in the right place to do that at the time. When you start thinking about the vision, I think it's easy to not really close in on what you really want. So we actually brought in a company called Adcura to help us, experts in the decisioning space. So we actually brought them in to help us really articulate that vision clearly. And Steve talked about the visualization scenarios that we used to do that, about thinking about where we wanted to get to, what we wanted that customer experience to look like. We involved our IT companies really early on, colleagues, early on to make sure that we could think about this. So we started looking at the options, how we would think about extending the capability we had, or whether we needed to think about other options.
Now, ultimately, these folks are, and you and I have talked about this quite a bit. When they come up with this assessment, they're making some recommendations that are pretty foundational stuff, right? In some ways, can be pretty scary. Things around the vision and the infrastructure, and ultimately, kind of the way that you're going to go to market. Now, did you folks get any pushback internally around that, or was that an easy?
No, so I think that was a bit about bringing in IT into the conversation early. Okay. So if you're going to have a conversation and change capability, if you get them in the door, so they're as part of those conversations, I think that was really important. Also, I think it's very obvious Adcura have a lot of experience in this space, so they're credible. They can clearly have that conversation, and we brought in important people into that review. So we didn't just go, hey, man, bam, there you go, this is the answer. We actually walked them all through as we went through it.
Okay, bring everybody together and make a joint decision.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, tell me this, what did you folks decide ultimately?
So ultimately we decided that what we had, we couldn't really extend into the place we wanted to go to. It wouldn't realise our vision. So we actually agreed that we would re-platform now so we could grow into our new solution and survive for as long as we possibly can, years and years and years, hopefully.
Now, ultimately, when you went through this, there had to be options, right? So what did these options look like for you folks? And as I fix my presentation here so that it actually goes forward. But what did the investment options look like?
Yeah, so we came up with 3 options out the back of this review of what we could do. The first one was we already had a Best Next Action and an outbound campaign tool. Best Next Action, our inbound decisioning, was on an SQL platform, but kind of a proof of concept. So we wanted to get them off. So we talked about moving the Best Next Action into the same tool as the outbound campaigning were. That would have given us a solution for the inbound, so they would have been on a strategic platform, but it wouldn't have been a tied-up solution still. So it doesn't achieve the vision, and definitely no on-demand decisioning. So our campaign tool that exists today can't do real-time. The second option, and actually there was other things that campaign tool couldn't do, like optimization for a start. The second option was to move the inbound decisioning onto the same platform as well, but add some extra bells and whistles. So the campaign tool we were using could have added on an optimization tool, and it could have added on some extra functionality. But again, it wouldn't have been real time, and it still would have been, suboptimal for us.
All right. This makes sense to me.
The third option
Oops.
was to re-platform now.
I was trying to cut you off.
Yeah, that's all right.
All right.
So the third option was to actually re-platform now onto a new solution, so something that we could actually get to our vision on and that would allow us real time and would allow us integrated strategies across all channels.
Okay. So here's my next question for you. So ultimately, why did Pega, why was the Pega decisioning solution the one that you folks decided to go with?
That's quite an easy question to answer, I'll be honest. So we obviously had an RFP. We had to go and look at other people. The one thing that strikes us there's a couple of things really. So Pega has a centralized solution. So it's one solution where you can build all your strategies centralized and then serve it out to channel. We talked to other vendors who actually still believe that capability is different for inbound and outbound. They're fundamentally different and they can't be in one tool. And Pega don't share that vision, and nor do we. So that was a great alignment. The second one is about the cloud infrastructure. So the cloud was great for us. It would allow us to move forward very, very quickly and mobilize very, very quickly. And actually, when we talked to other vendors, we had some lovely conversations about their cloud, which wasn't really cloud and was in fact fog.
Understood. So if I heard you right on the Pega side, right, what you're really saying is that at the end of the day, when you're talking to other vendors, inbound and outbound essentially are disconnected, right? But when you're talking about Pega, what you've really got is customer strategy in the middle, and at the end of the day, inbound and outbound are unified. Fair?
I'd actually say there is no inbound and outbound, there are channels.
Fantastic
I'd remove
way to
those
say
two
it.
words.
Fantastic way to say it. Okay, so can you walk us through, Joe, ultimately, Steve's laid out the vision for us. You've talked to us about how you're going to update your infrastructure and ultimately how that's going to work. Can you lay out the transformation plan for us in terms of the steps that you use to kind of get to where you need to be?
Yep. So one of our plans was to do this in phases so that we could realise benefit fast and also get that inbound decisioning off of a platform very, very quickly. So that was one of our kind of tactical solutions. The other one was to steer away from as much IT investment as we could. So move to OPEX rather than CAPEX. So we had 4 phases. The first one was to move our best next action, our inbound decisioning, onto Pega. So that allowed us to take them off that proof of concept, put them on a strategic platform, put them in the cloud, put in the plumbing to allow us to move data to and from our data structures, and realise any benefit. So that went
Purely
live.
Inbound at this point.
Sorry,
Right?
purely inbound,
Okay.
and also batch,
Okay.
not real time. So
Right.
we made a clear decision not to do real time early on. We'll come to that later. So
When you
that's
say batch, can I ask you this? Are you talking synchronized moves back and forth between, say, your data lake or the cloud and...
yeah. So what I'm talking about is we take data up very early in the morning, up into the cloud, and then we run our decision strategies across 23 million parties. So by party, I mean customer kind of accounts, and then we output a decision for every one of those, and then send that back to channel.
Okay, makes sense.
So that's phase 1. Phase 2, which is due to go live end of October this year, brings the inbound and the outbound strategies together under one roof. So gone is the word inbound and outbound, and in is the word centralized strategies and channel second. That's when we join up our customer conversations. That is still in batch, so still we will send the data up on a daily basis and then send the results back on a daily basis. Phase 3 is when we take the move into real time. So for us, it was a conscious decision to get the benefit, which is bringing the two kind of types of channel together. So we have centralized strategies and then go real time. So do it joined up, create the seamless conversations, and then go real time. So phase 3 is digital. So we took digital first because digital has an awful lot of data. There's great context that we can get when customers are moving between pages. That's really useful for us. And also we can start to improve our email in part of that phase as well. And that will go live at some point next year, sort of first half of 2017. And then our final phase, in phase 4, we'll move all the other channels into real time as well, particularly the inbound call centres, where it's really important to add that context by way of real time.
Okay. So in case you've re-platformed inbound, you will be integrating inbound and outbound, and that's currently going on as we speak. And then ultimately, it's real time. It's basically real time integration, and that's in 2017, essentially, one stage at a time. So you talked a little bit earlier about Pega Cloud. Now, what did Pega Cloud really bring to you in terms of the cloud in general? How'd that help you in this situation?
The biggest one is speed. So the fact that we could actually spring up a platform within, and can do it within a couple of weeks, and then improve the speed, so by changing and giving it a bit more oomph, which we have done kind of overnight. It's also elastic, so we have an agreement as part of our contract with Pega that we have to reach a certain SLA for our batch. So if performance starts to dip, Pega have to give us some more oomph.
So we're on the hook, basically. All right.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So it's about being scalable, it's about speed, it's about the elasticity, yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. So you've got ultimately 4 phases here, but what were the major challenges ultimately? Say you're in, phase 1. What were the major challenges that you folks went through? Well, let's back up a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit about the work streams that you use? Ultimately, how'd you break down the work for phase 1?
Yeah, sure. So phase 1 wasn't really a lift and shift, it was a lift, improve and shift from where we were within our inbound decisioning. So there was 3 clear work streams within that. The first one was around our partners. So Adcura have been responsible for helping us articulate our requirements, think about what those journeys might look like, and then actually configuring the solution for us in Pega. They've also been involved in other work streams, but they're kind of the owner of this work stream. Then the second one is around data. So we are moving our data from a structured data warehouse to a data lake, or big data, as we speak, on Hadoop. That's kind of something that's in train as a separate program within British Gas. So we need to be able to pull that data from that lake into what we call bricks and constructions, so the format that we need to bring it and push it up into the cloud. The guy running it likes Lego, so that's why we call it bricks and constructions. The third one then is around the kind of the plumbing, so the system. So we have a lake on here, and we have a cloud up here, and we need to move data between the two. And for that, we needed a bit of IT help to move that up and down.
Now, as you go through phase 1, ultimately you've got these, essentially you've got these 3 work streams, if you will. You move to phase 2, and you've kind of got the same thing going on, but then a bunch of additional work, if you will.
Yes.
Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so the additional stuff in phase 2, so you're right, we had the same work streams as phase 1, but we've added on a couple of extras. And they're really around the strategy and the business readiness. So when you're thinking about bringing 2 teams, 2 capabilities together, it's not as simple as just going, hey, presto, let's stick them together. You've actually got to think about what that needs to look like, what the customer experience is. That's actually quite a big deal, because you've got 2 teams who think very differently. They even use different words. So we have one team over here calling it campaign and one over here calling it an offer. And you've got to move them into the world of the same terminology, start thinking about offer first and then channel second. And that's part of that. So we have to think about the strategy, but also getting people brains working in the right way. Then there's a bit around the business readiness, which is about bringing those people up to speed, so a little bit around the process, the target operating model. When you've got 2 teams who work very differently, they need to have a single way of briefing. They're going to be one team. You can't have them briefing in new propositions in a different way just because they come from a different team. And how that...
One way or another, it has to be consistent.
Exactly. So there's a lot about that. There's a lot about training people up. They've all got to be comfortable with the new tool set. So that's kind of additional work streams for us in phase 2.
In this phase, ultimately, your folks come heavily into play. Now, ultimately, how does this, how are you involved in these work streams, and how does this impact what you do?
Yeah, so I think you've got a good sense now. Joey's running kind of the technology elements and bringing the platform for me. The bits, I've got kind of 2 things to do. One is it's effectively a bit of rewiring the organisation's brain for customer. So my days are really spent out talking to the organisation, saying, well, if we've kind of, now you know about this capability and what it can kind of do for you, how are we going to change some of our journeys and our thinking, so we start some of that innovation we need, and we really need to start really focusing on getting seamless across channels, We need to think about kind of how we might change our products and offerings. So there's a kind of a lot of conversations about that, which absolutely informs proposition development, some of those other things. And then I kind of go, so I've got a number of other capabilities. So I've got a kind of a big selection of teams from kind of marketing effectiveness, ROMI. We've got propensity modeling and analytics team. They've all got to go on a journey effectively to move into my new home effectively, or Joe's new home. So we're really making sure that kind of this project really gets what it needs at the I guess it's kind of lean production really, where things just arriving just in time to make sure everything that whether it's model scores or analytics or components, or people have had the right training and know to move onto the platform, etc. So we're kind of making sure that's moving as a whole work stream to kind of together.
So your team's on board though, ultimately. At the end of the day, because that's what we face a lot of times, is when you're consolidating kind of your work streams and your strategies, is that sometimes people just fear that ultimately I'm going to lose control of what I do for day to day. Would you say your teams are on board with this and ready to go?
Absolutely. I think one thing that's really great about my team is they really focus on kind of customer experience and bringing the best customer experiences possible. When you start talking about this capability, they want it just as much. And I think probably the thing that they believe is it's about doing the right thing for the customer, for our customers, and that's one of our tenets of the team. And then actually, in reality, it's about them being extraordinary together in terms of their way they work together. They start doing some of the problem solving, so we're getting involved in some kind of really rich conversations about how this, right down in the guts of it, how it should work, what the contact rules should be, those sorts of things. And it's actually quite an enjoyable conversation to watch people and start to figure some of this out. And we know that not too many people have done this, so actually they feel quite proud in their capabilities for the organisation and what they're driving.
Ultimately, I think Joe nailed it a little bit earlier. This is no longer inbound marketing and outbound marketing. It's really a connected customer conversation.
Absolutely.
So Joe, stage 3 and stage 4 are all about real time at the end of the day. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit, what you're trying to do there and kind of what that might look like?
Yeah, so we're going to pick off, I mentioned we're going to pick off digital first, and then move on to other channels so that we can get the learnings. And also I think digital is going to be not so much the challenge, but the opportunity. And our digital teams are keen. They think they can do it on their own. There have historically been decisioning solutions in the digital space. The trouble is that they're siloed. So we need to move them fast. So otherwise, before they go off and do something on their own, and we get even more problems with disconnected customer experience. So that's why we're moving to digital first, and we also bring in the email capability at that point.
What kind of gains do you get out of it ultimately when you bring real time into play? What's that really give you?
It's about adding the kind of the colour to the conversation. So we make it more timely, we make it more relevant. So when a customer calls into our call centre or they go online, if they go online and they fall on a page looking at kind of boiler insulation, don't start talking to them about electricity. They're obviously interested in home care, So it's about, customers expect us to know what they're thinking. So we need to try and get to that point where we're kind of at least close.
Like if I heard you right, it really allows you to get very close to the customer and make decisions at the point that you're going to interact with them. So the most informed decisions possible.
Absolutely,
Fair?
absolutely.
All right, now let's ask you guys both this, but ultimately, can you explain to us just why is this project succeeding? Because if you think about it, this is a really large effort, right? This is a 4-stage project with a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of competing goals, if you will. But Joe, why would you say that this is really working for British Gas?
So I'd say there's a couple of reasons. One of them is around the fact that we're leading this from the business. So it's a business-led program of activity to move us to customer experience. So it's led by the people who understand about customer experience rather than who understand about plugging stuff together. I know I'm oversimplifying things, but just trying to prove the point that we have clear ideas of what we want, and we don't want to lose some of that in translation. We have great partners, so I've talked a little bit about Adcura. They are extremely experienced in this space. They've done a lot to help some of the thought leadership, some of those conversations Steve talked about. They're really, really interested about contact strategy. That's not an easy conversation to have, so we have to think about that. And I think the other one is, the third one is about the timeliness. We've actually been timely and relevant ourselves, so the fact that we've moved our data onto a big data platform means that we're doing this at the right time. We're starting to pull all our data in one place, starting to self-serve as a business. So it's given us the opportunity to take this on as a business-led program as well.
Steve, would you add any color there ultimately around why this is succeeding?
Yeah, there's as I said, it's a little bit maybe a build on the right time sort of stuff. Is I think one of the things we've heard a lot about at this conference is about the digital transformation, and that kind of, we talk about it as a drive to online in our organisation. So, there's a lot of actual, I suppose, things going on in the UK energy market. A lot of change, a lot of regulation change coming and things like that. So absolutely, this scene is a kind of a program that can kind of drive us the opportunity to, really start to get more personalised with our offers and our bundles, and in a time where we can actually get back to having those type of tools in our armoury effectively. I think that's one of the great things, and it also just fits with the way the technology stack is going in the organisation. So big, cloud, Hadoop, these are all kind of buzzwords around the organization. And I think actually, so that's the one thing that, kind of actually we're very much aligned with kind of the business and the IT side are effectively all kind of agreed this is becoming actually one of the proof cases of the ways to deliver projects in the organization. So it's a bit of a role model.
So what you folks have heard today, primarily, is the British Gas story. So you've heard about their vision for customer experience. You heard Joe kind of define what next generation decisioning is for British Gas, which is more than just essentially technology. It's kind of a concept that they're embracing, right? You've heard Steve talk about how they're trying to move from product push to customer conversation, which is, I think, something that every marketer, at the end of the day, every person on the experience side, that kind of resonates with you, because it's something we're all trying to do. You heard Joe talk about the transformation plan. She walked through all the stakeholders and the work streams and ultimately what's driving their success. So what I'd love to do now is give Joe and Steve a round of applause because they did a tremendous job. And with that, we can open up to any questions. If anybody wants to ask these folks anything, now's your shot. If not, then I might just tell another story, and that could be painful. So go right ahead. And the question, if you folks couldn't hear it, was they have a very staged approach to this implementation, and do they have KPIs ultimately that relate to each stage and help drive, and show success or show progress? Yeah, so the way I think about it is we've certainly built quite a detailed business case which kind of enshrines some of those KPIs behind this project. So in the first couple of phases, some of our KPIs have been around actually making some of the platform cost changes. So that has actually been kind of cost advantages, just to kind of swap out a more traditional data warehouse for some of that cloud-based infrastructure. So that's one of those things, and we know there's a lot of benefit in this, but we've been careful to bake benefits at the right time. So we didn't actually, for our first phase that went live, it was primarily a lift and shift. We didn't actually put anything in the business case for that, but we've seen a 20% increase in kind of conversion. So this now starts to inform, and we've got the opportunity to revisit that business case as we go forward. So we'll start to look at, we're going to form a hypothesis about what bringing inbound and outbound together, and then we'll layer something on top around about move to real time, but we also know we're removing inefficient contact along the way. We're making some changes in our kind of people structures around, so it's a one team. So we've got kind of quite a clear view, yeah. Any additional questions? All right, well, thank you, folks. We appreciate your time.